Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in a minute. Give people another minute or two to join. All right, I think we should go ahead and get started.
Good morning, and welcome everyone to the Pathways Regional Organization Formation and Governance Stakeholder Workshop. Thank you everyone for your attendance today and your active participation. We hope that you will engage in this conversation to the same degree that we've been having such successful stakeholder engagement with our stakeholder working group. We don't have GridWorks here to support us today. We've appreciated their help in our other work stream, but we will, launch committee members will do our best to facilitate the same kind of robust dialogue here today. We also appreciate all of the time that you have all been spending on this. I keep seeing a lot of the same folks in our participant list, and I know that it is a lot of time that you guys are all putting in here. We do appreciate that engagement and especially your perspectives as we work through the step 2 of our Pathways initiative. And with that, I will turn it over to, I believe, Lisa to kick us off into our content today.
Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you, Pam, for that introduction. Yes, I am standing in for Evie Call today because with Evie Call, who represents the California Community Choice Association, and Ben Otto, who represents the Northwest Energy Coalition, I lead the Regional Organization Formation Work Group. We have been considering options for the formation of the actual entity, which will act as the regional organization, which we'll call the RO at times this morning. So we wanted to look at the actual legal requirements for an entity and where it should be formed and in what form of entity in order to do business as an independent governance host for market services in the West. Next slide, please. So we wanted to talk about what type of organization best suits the regional organization's purpose and operation. Next slide, please. We considered 4 types of organizations. One can form a public benefit nonprofit, a 501c3, which many of you work with all of the time. They're organized and operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, and those other purposes that all of your favorite nonprofits are formed to serve. They can be small, they can be very large. They have elements and restrictions on their activities that allow them that nonprofit status so that they don't pay income taxes and are very often exempt from state property and sales taxes, as are some of these other organizations, but most often those benefits are allocated to 501c3s. We also considered forming a social welfare nonprofit known as a 501c4 under the IRS code, formed under section 501c4. Those are organized and operated exclusively for the promotion of the common good and welfare of the people. So that highfalutin language means that they are also formed to serve the public interest in many ways similar to 501c3, but they are also allowed some leeway and have different restrictions and benefits available to them. All of these types of organizations, by the way, have been used to form governing organizations for electricity wholesale regional markets in the US, and so I'll talk about that further on. We've considered forming a mutual benefit nonprofit under IRS Code 501c6. Those entities are organized and operated to promote the common business interests of its members, like a chamber of commerce or a trade organization, like the organization I represent, the Interwest Energy Alliance. We considered briefly forming a for-profit corporation, which is organized to serve the interests of its shareholders over the interests of the public. And so next slide, please. These types of organizations have been used, as I said, to operate markets in the past or operate the governance of a market. And that includes CAISO, ISO New England, and the New York ISO operating as 501c3s for explicitly to serve the public benefit. MISO and ERCOT were both formed as social welfare organizations as 501c4s. SPP, the Western Power Pool, and the Western Regional Advocacy Program have been formed as business leagues or 501c6 organizations. And PJM is standing out there alone as an LLC. Next slide, please. So we did a lot of research about what these organizations can and cannot do, and we considered political issues and issues of familiarity and issues down the road, including how well they can perform the functions of independent governance in the future if those services provided by the markets change and morph. So we looked at how this type of organization will serve multiple state interests and multiple types of utility interests and a growing number of market services in case the markets do morph into more like RTO types of services in the future. But we mostly looked at how they would operate, employing people and renting or owning real estate and other property as necessary to be organized and operate as a viable entity in or serving multiple states in the West. So we looked at what benefits and restrictions are imposed on 501c3 organizations. Though 501c3, 4, and 6 are all tax exempt, as I indicated, exempt from income tax, under the federal and state laws, but they also must apply for exemption for property and sales taxes in most states. They're usually granted that, but it depends on the types of services they provide. Only 501c3 organizations are provided tax-exempt financing opportunities. So the benefit of that depends to great extent on interest rates and the restrictions on that tax-exempt financing. Lobbying is only allowed in an insubstantial basis with a maximum expenditure limit on 501c3s, but is allowed for the other three types of organizations. Issue advocacy is allowed for all of them. Political campaign expenditures are prohibited for 501c3 organizations, but allowed to a limited extent for C4s and C6s. Next slide, please. So we came up after much research and talking with other organizations, including other market operators around the country, and looking at all of the issues I mentioned, with a straw proposal, which we want your input about. We are putting this out for your consideration, questions, and input. We considered the public purpose of a 501c3 organization, which provides societal benefit. We considered tax consequences that tax-exempt financing, which CAISO, in fact, has used in the past. It does come with a slew of restrictions, which makes it only appropriate under limited circumstances, but sometimes it can be very beneficial in a financial way by lowering costs of financing, long-term financing and bonding. And we considered the lobbying and campaigns, limitations on 501c3s, and the wider berth granted to 501c4s, because we came down to focusing on C3s or C4s as the primary likely types of entities we wanted to form. We thought that 501c6s had a more limited type of role in, and when they are used in a market, it's often from a history of being active as a power pool, which is a completely valid way to continue to operate a market. But since we are starting a new type of organization, and we do want to promote the public purposes and our, as you've seen in our other discussions, talking about new ways of providing this independent governance, we wanted to start with new eyes and looked at 501c4 and 501c3s most closely as the possibilities. So we compared the lobbying and political campaign engagement opportunities for each. And we thought that there was some limits, some benefits to limiting the decision-making authority over political campaigning. So we put the proposal of organizing as a 501c3 out for your consideration. I'm going to speed up a little bit here. Next slide, please. We, as you see here, CAISO, ISO, New England, and New York ISO have identified 501c3 specific types of organizations, and we would pull from those benefits which seem to serve the independent governance of the new regional organization. Next slide, please. So we decided in which state should the regional organization incorporate. Now that doesn't necessarily equate to the state in which it is most active or holds offices and employs people, but it does implicate what state laws will govern the corporate activities and board activities. Next slide, please. So we propose to form the RO under Delaware state law. We can incorporate in any Western state, and most of them have adopted fairly standard nonprofit statutes, but they do have differences related to their amount of oversight and strict rules for formation of a board. Whereas Delaware is quite flexible and considered to be a leader for corporate governance, both nonprofit and for-profit. Delaware is increasingly used by new corporations for a number of reasons. I won't read all of them, but they provide a lot of flexibility and ongoing expertise that we can draw upon, and experts guiding the RO can draw upon as they go forward, simply to tell the board what our best practices in their organization and decision-making. These laws do not govern the operation of the market itself at all, but rather how and when the board decides to hold meetings, how it is required to be transparent in its actual board functions, that sort of things. And so you can read the other considerations we thought about. We still need to qualify to do business in the states in which the market will operate, which will be likely most states which it touches in the West. And it will need to register as a charity in the principal place of business. It will have some oversight by state law in the laws in which it operates, certainly related to employment law. And we have not done a state-by-state comparison of insurance laws and things like that, but we think that Delaware fits the purpose, and other markets are formed in Delaware as well. Many, if not most, are formed in Delaware. And most particularly, it serves the multiple states in which this market will operate. Next slide, please. So where should the principal place of business be? Next slide. We considered where the actual center of direction, control, and coordination will be, where the most significant volume of the corporation's operations will be located. Any Western state that we choose would present a question of perception of bias and control rather than independence of that state, and we considered all of that. So, but we considered that to be of limited actual risk, and a limited risk in the event the state of incorporation withdraws from the RO. Next slide, please. Other considerations related to the principal place of business include the extent of interaction with the CAISO. We know that there will be shared employees to some extent, certainly ongoing communication between employees. The RO will have its own employees. We do not yet know whether they will be few or larger in number, depending on how Step 2 shapes up. We do want the RO to rotate its physical presence around the West to the extent that we will recommend that it holds meetings physically in various states around the West, because that will enable stakeholder engagement and a feeling of representation within each of those states. The RO will likely be bound to some extent by the principal place of business host state. Our straw proposal for your consideration, though, is co-location with CAISO in Folsom, California, because of the efficiencies brought by that adjacency. And I think that's all for my slides. Next slide. We wanted to suggest to you how the formation will play out over the next year. By December, we anticipate creating a formation committee. January through August, we will develop the corporate structure, draft bylaws and a tariff, select a nominating committee, select an executive search firm. Then the California legislation will be considered and finalized. After that, we will file tariff language at FERC. And I say we, I mean sort of the West-wide we. We will recruit RO board members, recruit RO executive team, and by fall of 2025, we hope to file the incorporation documents, seat the board, and hire staff. With that, I will actually close and then open it up for comments by Ben Otto, who is, as I said, my partner in crime on this work group, a co-leader of the RO organization work group.
All right, thanks, Lisa. I don't have anything revolutionary to add. You did an excellent job. I'll just remind folks that what we're talking about here is the corporate structure and the process by which decisions are made, but the actual market operations and rules around that, that's through FERC and decided that way. So just reminding folks that there's two buckets here, and Lisa did an excellent job.
Thank you. I would also reiterate again that the organizational governance is what you will primarily be interested in, I believe. And that is to come. So we may only have a comment or two at this point, but then let's launch into the governance discussion about how board members are selected and things, because I think that's the meat of it. But I am available for any questions or discussion. And I turn it back over to Pam and Kathleen to lead that.
Thanks, Lisa. And thanks, Ben. First off, wanted to check in with any launch committee members to see if anybody else has any additional comments on this piece. Scott.
Thanks, Kathleen and Pam, and thanks to Lisa and Ben for the work that you folks have done on this. It was a fascinating dive into what the other markets do. I'm completely in agreement that the body of Delaware state law is probably the most mature for formation, and it's certainly been where most of the markets are incorporated in terms of from a legal precedent and body of law standpoint. The interesting discussion I found, at least among launch committee members, was principal place of business. And I used to joke that California's view of its own sovereignty is similar to that of Virginia's in 1861. But then I realized that, quite frankly, we're in a period in our history when all the states sort of have that view of their sovereignty. And the reality is that given this step with the RO, and even if we go to 2.5, which envisions a slightly larger employment structure for the RO than in 2.0, the interaction with CAISO seems to suggest that co-locating in Folsom makes the most efficient sense, and particularly since we're building an organization that's it's a hybrid organization. But that having been said, I'm glad to see we're anticipating that board meetings and things like that will be in the various states where the RO is doing business, and so it's intended to be as much of a Western organization as possible. So I think this makes complete sense to me. After we had a little wild discussion about why not Salt Lake City, let's do it near a hub airport. I can remember when MISO was being stood up, people talked about putting it near O'Hare Airport, but given the nature of what we're talking about in step two, this certainly seems to make a lot of sense to me. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Scott. Any other? Connor and Joe, I'll come back to you. We're gonna let me hit all the launch committees first, then I'd really like to open it up for stakeholder questions and input. But Connor, if you want to jump in.
Sure, yeah, appreciate it. Obviously, the issue of perception within the Pacific Northwest is one that's going to be important. But ultimately, I think the most important element of that is going to be the work of the RO moving around and making those touch points and interactions happen in the individual states out there. So we put a lot of thought into this, and I think that putting this principal place of business, wherever it makes the most sense from a legal perspective, from a recruiting perspective for the staff, all those elements. I think that's most important to focus on. And then ultimately the issue of perception, I think from our perspective, is going to be making sure that when we are interacting with the RO, we're not feeling like we're having to go to Folsom every single time there's a board meeting or otherwise, and that these things are happening in the states that are affected by this market. So appreciate all the work and appreciate the time.
Thanks, Connor. Any other launch committee members or work group members want to jump in here? There will be additional opportunities. Joe.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I'm wondering if I can hear from the team on how the type of organization impacts the relationship that the board would have with the stakeholder process, and in particular, how would the board review proposals coming out of the stakeholder process under the different types of organizations under consideration?
Thank you for that question, Joe. This is Lisa, and I'll respond by saying the social benefit of a 501c4 is very similar to the public purpose of a 501c3, and those are way overgeneralized. And what we learned and realized from our own, histories, but also talking to lawyers and lawyers for other markets around, is that they rely to a great extent on their own governance documents that will indicate what how the public purpose of a 501c3 is to play out in their decision making. But it will also be driven in most significant part probably by the process, because how a question is posed to the board by a stakeholder and governance process will shape the decision-making by that board. And so what the bylaws say is the role of the board and what it should emphasize, and how that stakeholder process fleshes out the decisions placed before the board will be the primary guideposts, and rather than the type of 501c organization we have formed. Ben, what do you want to add to that?
I would add that a 501c4 is largely a membership-based organization where the members under that legal structure have a more direct influence on the board of directors. Whereas a 501c3 doesn't necessarily have that same membership structure. So for a broad stakeholder public interest group, you can have a process by which those stakeholders have a much more direct path to the board of directors. Now, the specifics will be worked out by the governance work group after us, but that is a difference in the background legal structure. C4s are more member-based, C3s are much more public stakeholder-based.
Thanks, Ben and Lisa. I think, and maybe just to add, Joe would encourage you to if you were unable to join us for our stakeholder process workshop yesterday, we have a posted recording, and part of what we were discussing was how issues come up through the stakeholder process, and what role stakeholders play versus the staff as those issues sort of work their way from inception to implementation. I'm not going to say we solved the problems, but we did have a good conversation, and we're going to have another stakeholder process workshop next week that we'll be focusing on sectors and voting. But that's another place where this conversation is happening as well. Any other, Joe, sorry, I say Papa.
I just wanted to thank you. Yeah, that was helpful.
Great. Any other questions or comments about the way we're thinking about the sort of corporate structure and place of business? Any concerns? Does this sound good to everybody?
I would also note that the principal place of business can be changed. And we have had a lot of discussion about it ultimately being the decision of the RO. And it may be shaped by how step 2 turns out to look. We don't know what step 2 in a final form will be yet, and that may weigh on this decision.
Thanks, Lisa. Kamaya. And Kamaya, sorry, before you jump in, and I meant to say this but before we jumped into this, if you want to state your name and your organization, and that would be great as we move forward, just so we know who we're hearing from. So go ahead, Kamaya.
Of course. Kimaya Abreu. I'm with Voltus. We're an aggregator of distributed energy resources. Lisa, I think you basically answered my question, but I was curious if the principal place of business was envisioned as permanent. And it sounds like the answer is no. So my follow-up is there a sense of like a timeline on which as the RO develops and grows, it could possibly move elsewhere into the West, away from the sort of California perception of California centrality?
And I think that answer is yes, it could. If it changed in its principal operation, actual locations, or it could have 2 offices or more if needed. You know, we'll see what is most efficient. Of course, concentration is generally efficient, but absolutely it can be changed with board decision and filing some paperwork. The state law will, we're talking in the chat, state laws will have some minimum requirements when we apply for tax exemption under state laws if the RO proceeds to do that. But we can talk about that as the RO is formed and starts making decisions.
Thank you.
And if I might add on there too, we don't have at this point a timeline for what we've been sort of thinking about as phase 3, the beyond the work of the Pathways Initiative and the evolution of the new regional organization into, you know, adding on additional market services and the evolution to something bigger and more robust. But I think that's it's a really important question that we'll need to continue to consider, because I think as we add additional services, the idea is that the RO, with an independently governed structure, will be less tied to California and the CAISO will be adding things on. The CAISO as a balancing authority will be participating on par with other balancing authorities in the West. So I think it's a good thing for us to be thinking about as we continue to evolve. Scott, do you want to jump in on that, or did you want
to? Yeah, I as somebody, and I'll remind everybody who that I've always been a proponent of getting to the next step beyond the 2 steps that we're talking about. But the launch committee's writ of responsibility here is to just get us to the RO. What happens after that is anybody's guess. I have given the history of what happened in MISO, where there were still the control areas and things like that, I have a feeling that as the market evolves, there is going to be some changes, but that's going to be when the RO board is in charge and the stakeholders are interacting with the board. It will be long past what the launch committee is doing with you, the stakeholders. It'll be up to the stakeholders dealing with the RO at that point. So, but it's a great question and something to keep in mind because this is going to be an evolutionary structure.
Thanks, Scott.
And we do have a question
Oh.
in the chat. I might go ahead and read it aloud. It is
Yeah, go ahead.
accurate. Is it accurate to obtain tax exempt status under a 501c3 structure? A state may require the applicant to have bylaws that specify a minimum level of process, governance, and structure. And so, Ben, do you want to maybe just expand on your response here, or Lisa?
Yeah, I can do that. Just the layers are you form the corporation under state law, whether it's Delaware or another state, and that will set out the minimum requirements for the form, like the number of board members, process and notice requirements for decision making, reporting, that type of thing. The federal 501c3 law layers us a few more requirements, but they largely align with state in order to get that tax exempt status. Then there's actually a third layer around independence largely, and that comes from FERC's rules for independent governance of markets. So those three layers stack up to give you your minimum requirements that we would all fit in.
Thanks, Ben. And thank you, Pam, for flagging the chat. Lynn.
Hi there. My name's Lynn Mossdollar, and I'm the new executive director for the New Mexico Renewable Energy Transmission Authority. And we're sort of new to the pathways discussion. Glad to see it's going on, and are generally supportive to see another choice in the RO discussion. I just had a comment. I mean, as we were going through this, the choice of, I think the words used was co-location in Folsom really caught my ear as probably the most, if not the only, controversial issue presented so far, and pricked my ears because my board chair is particularly, I guess, California takeover phobic in this whole process. And so I wanted to suggest, I mean, I understand the reasoning and that there'd be flexibility and ability to change it, and it would, probably be a decision made further down the road, but maybe stay away from the term co-location to minimize the controversy, because you can, I mean, I assume there would be completely separate offices. It would just be in the city of Folsom, not, a back room in the CAISO offices. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn, for that comment. And yes, and it's important to shine a light on these perceptions and why we have them. And obviously our language is important. The reason we said we may need to lean towards principal place of business in Folsom is because of efficiencies, but we will make, we being the wider West, but certainly the RO board will avoid the appearance of California control as much as possible, but that also has driven some of these recommendations related to Delaware state law and the full consideration of location in other states as well, which could present a similar bias at some point down the line. But thank you very much. We will take that into account.
Thanks, Lisa. Fred.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. It's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. I have been involved in all these different forms of organizations, actually helped to get C3 and C4 set up, gone through the paperwork, not recently, but so I have some appreciation for the issues involved here. I think that basically the way that this has been laid out is fine. And just to say something about the locational aspect, the only issue I have with Folsom is it's not easy to get to, and there not a whole lot of places to stay in town there, not close to the airport, etc. But meetings can happen elsewhere. I know that CAISO has had some meetings in Sacramento, for example, recently. In my kind of daydreaming mode, I thought that a good location for the RO would be Reno. Lots of air service. Everybody likes the area. You know, the Lake Tahoe's right there. You know, it's in Nevada, so it's in kind of not in California. And also, by the way, the IBEW local is the same as in Folsom. And I don't know if people know this, but the CAISO staff recently unionized, and there quite a few of them are members of IBEW. But in general, I think there's the pathways process has been characterized by a lot of very careful thinking and work. So I just wanted to say that's really good. And broadly speaking, I think this is a good proposal.
Thanks, Brad. Vijay.
Thank you, Vijay with WRA. First of all, kudos to this valuable work you all have done, Lisa, and everybody else on the legal team. It is my understanding from during the COVID period, I learned a lot about how CalISO had to manage their systems and operations. And I know we have Carl on this call and, of course, Scott Miller from his deep background. Isn't it my understanding with other RTOs, they have backup control rooms or control centers? So not really to address Lynn's concern, but I have my own curiosity. Are we envisioning or thinking about one or two backup control room centers that will be needed in the larger West? And in times of a pandemic-like situation, they will be activated to become more more of the running the machines or control systems, if in case the Folsom-based control room and monitoring system is down. So that's a question I had, and what are the appropriate legal requirements that will be needed to be put in place for that to happen? Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. I'll jump in first just to say, sure, there may well be that need or benefit for reliability or otherwise in the future, but it's a market-based question that the RO can consider in the future. I think it's too early to tell. As the EDAM grows, let's, you know, it will be an opportunity, and it depends a lot on how step 2 is framed. So I think it's too early to tell, but it's certainly a possibility. We should imagine this RO being active in each state in which a utility is a market participant, or there are other market participants active in that state. Tony, I think your hand was up if you want to address this, and Jim.
Yeah, actually, the point I was going to make is definitely related to this and might provide some information. So one of the reasons the CAISO is in the Sacramento area is relatively lower as compared to other California areas, risk of seismic events. And so I think that's a factor in, you know, its location in Folsom, which as Fred noted, is not by the airport. All BAs have to have backup control centers, and the ISO has one. It's in Lincoln, California, I believe, which is even farther.
Correct.
You know, I know early on, I know this is a detail, but early on there was some consideration of whether the offices, and it's a fairly new building, could provide that separation from the headquarters. So I know that's a detail to be determined, but I just wanted, because this question has come up, and I couldn't quite catch the name of the lady that had the wonderful, terrible towel in the background, but yeah, that those types of options I think probably are on the table, and that might go some distance to, you know, providing something more than a glass wall, you know, that's looking into the control room as far as the separation of staff and interactions. But it's also really, really helpful to have the backup control center in proximity so that staff can go back and forth. And if you've got shifts and you have sickness in the, you know, on the desks and things like that, that you're getting a lot of substitution ability to substitute and things like that. So having a backup control center in a completely remote place from the CAISO is probably not ideal for a host of those reasons.
Perfect. Thank you for answering that, Tony. And I think My 2 points were, one, think about the backup control center, but Lisa's point is valid. It's too early to plan. But I just feel from a social and political perspective as well, if co-locating the main RO will be in Folsom, not too far into Nevada or somewhere, it's not too far, the border, having a backup control center in another state would add the credibility and the buy-in also. Just a comment and feedback. Thank you.
I will note the CAISO runs its control centers hot. So it's not a actual backup. They operate simultaneously out of both control centers. And that ability to like commute to both is, I think, a key component of the redundancy of reliability in that hot approach to the two control centers. And I hear the feedback, Vijay, but I think that there's some operational benefits from that ability for the operators to be able to seamlessly operate out of either facility on any given day, especially as they do run hot for redundancy.
Thank you. I learned something today. I appreciate it.
I did too, Vijay, for what it's worth. Learn something new every day. Kelsey.
I just want to offer, that there was a model when PRC had dual control centers in, I think it was Vancouver and Loveland. So it does work, but I personally have no issue with the optics or the present configuration with the two in California either.
Thanks, Kelsey. Any other questions or comments on our RO formation portion of the agenda? We can always come back at the very end too, and given after our next conversation, and happy to continue this discussion. I do think if I may just make one, just to tie a few of the comments together, I think it's important for us all to remember that what we're working on a proposal for is the initial structure and formation of this new regional organization that will have sort of limited services and capacity, and this is really a starting point. And we envision, and I think the original vision of the regulators in their letter a year ago envisioned something evolving into a bigger West-wide, more comprehensive set of market services and transmission services and reliability services. And so there's a lot of evolution still to happen. And I think what we're trying to find right now is where's the best place to start? What's the best starting structure that, as it continues to evolve, has the flexibility baked into it to evolve in the right way for the West? So that's, if I may tie all those pieces together in that way. And with that, Jim, I'm going to pass it over to you to walk us through our proposal and discussion about RO governance.
Thank you, Kathleen. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jim Shetler. I serve as the General Manager for the Balancing Authority of Northern California. I also serve as a sector rep for the public power sector to the Launch Committee. And on the Launch Committee, I serve as a co-chair for the admin group, as well as a co-chair on the Regional Organization Governance Work Group, along with Jan Smutny-Jones. Jan, either fortunately or unfortunately, finds himself in the Azores right now, so won't be joining us for this discussion, but we'll work our way through anyway. Next slide, please. A little background stage setting here. When we formed the RO Governance Work Group, we identified a set of issues that we wanted this work group to take a look at and bring back some proposals. The issues are listed here. Issues around should there be joint meetings of the ISO board and the new RO board. How many board members should there be on the board? Should there be reservation of any seats, and if so, for what reason? What should the transition process be from the Western Energy Market Governing Body to the RO board? What pre-launch steps can we take prior to any California legislation being put in place? Is there a funding source that might be available in order to help fund the activities of forming the RO prior to any tariff funding being available? And then what should the selection process be for the RO board? One thing I wanted to also note is that we're not trying to develop in this effort detailed bylaws, charters, and so forth for the RO board. We view those as something that will be informed by what comes out of the legislation in California, as well as the development of tariff language. And so we believe that is best left to the formation committee that was talked about earlier. And then lastly, there are another 4 or so work groups looking at step 2 governance and step 2 formation and how that will evolve. And so we recognize as the governance working group that what we propose here may change or is subject to change. And one example is the stakeholder process. In what you'll see when you look at the selection process procedure that we've drafted for consideration, we made some assumptions about what the sectors would be and what those sector definitions would be. In parallel, we know that the stakeholder process group is looking at what should the stakeholders be and what groups should they be and how should the sectors be defined. So we recognize that as we evolve these two, that we'll have to change and modify potentially to accommodate that. So let's get into some of the more details. Next slide, please. So should there be joint meetings? One of the observations we had as we looked at this was we felt that the collaboration that had been developed between the governing body and the ISO board over the last year or so has been very productive, beneficial to not only the organizations, but the stakeholders involved. And though we recognize the relationship between the governing body and the board today versus the RO board and the ISO board in the future will be different, we still think there is benefit to having a collaborative relationship between the two boards. It is also anticipated that as we look at how the responsibilities are divvied up, that there probably will be some joint authority issues that both boards will have to consider. So we believe, number one, we want to promote collaboration between the two boards, and number two, that we are recommending that where appropriate, ideally for joint authority issues, that joint meetings will make a sense. Next slide, please. Number of seats. So when we looked at this, we were trying to balance making sure we had a large enough board to ensure that we had adequate diversity regionally, knowledge, and experience to govern the market rules, but at the same time not end up with a 20-person board or an unmanageable number of board members. So as we had our discussion within the work group, we did feel probably expanding beyond the current 5-member governing body made sense going forward. We felt that a 7-member board would be the right balance in trying to meet those desires. So our proposal is a 7-member board. Next slide, please. Reservation of board seats. Based on our discussions, we don't feel like there should be any seat reserved for a particular class or sector or knowledge skill. We think that the nominating committee and the board in their selection process should have the freedom to weigh what is the right person or right set of skills and knowledge that's needed at a particular time. So we're not recommending any kind of reservation of seats. However, one thing we did look at is we do think there is a benefit in considering some of the existing, or let me back up, considering all of the existing governing body members to the extent they're interested in being on the RO board and allowing them to participate. One thing we did discuss, and you'll see this in our proposal, is should we limit the number of governing body members that would transport over to the new RO board? And after debating that somewhat as to the pros and cons, because we do recognize there is benefit in having that knowledge or some of that knowledge available to the new board, we've suggested that yes, they should be considered, but they should not make up a majority of the new board when the board is seated. So that's our proposal. Next slide, please. Transition process. In our evaluation of this, we felt this is best left to the formation committee. Again, the formation committee will have the benefit of having the final step 2 proposal in front of it. It will have the benefit of working with a subset of the, let me back up. When we talk about the formation committee, what we've suggested is that the formation committee would be a subset of the launch committee and a subset of the WEM governing body. And so we're feeling that that group would probably be best positioned to develop the detailed transition plan on how do you get from the governing body to the RO board. And that doing that post step 2 launch or post step 2 recommendation and working with how California legislation is being developed, how tariff language is being developed, and that knowledge with the governing body makes the best sense for when that should be done. Next slide, please. Pre-launch prior to California legislation. The launch committee has developed a phase 2 work plan to try to get us from where we are today to a step 2 proposal and moving forward with step 2. And one of the things we determined is that we did not think it made sense to formally launch the new RO prior to having California legislation approved. Number one, that legislation can or may influence how the RO will be structured. We don't want to end up spending a lot of money on things if we're not sure we know what we're going to have or if legislation is approved. I think that's the other issue. Having said that, we do think there are formation efforts that can go forward. Finalizing the type of corporation, which we talked about earlier, developing tariff language that would be required to allow the RO to be formed, developing the bylaws for that, and developing the selection process and setting up that process in advance of the legislation. We think all makes sense to go forward, but not actually formally establishing the RO as an organization until we have that in place. So as was mentioned earlier in the outline of the schedule, we're saying that formal launch would be post legislation and post filing of the tariff, so we knew what all the language was. Next slide, please. Funding. So we recognize there will likely be a need for some level of funding to help set up the RO prior to having an approved tariff and a tariff source of funding. The assumption is that the long-term source of funding for the RO will be some form of administrative fee in the tariff. However, we're also concerned about who is that source of funding, what is that source of funding, and making sure that there's no conflict of interest or implied or otherwise that somebody has influence over the RO because of their funding source. So we do think there's two areas that make sense. One is DOE grant funding, and we are in the process of applying for additional, or applying again for funding from DOE. And then secondly, we think the funding of the pathways through the 501c3 mechanism that we have may be another avenue if we cannot get DOE funding. Next slide, please. Selection process. So after some discussion among the work group, we took the existing WEM governing body selection process and used that as a template, and then have modified that to reflect what we think makes sense for the RO board selection process. And so we have developed a draft procedure, not been approved. It's a work in progress, still being considered. But we thought it would be worthwhile to share that with the stakeholders to allow you to get a sense of what we're thinking and allow you an opportunity to provide some feedback on what our thoughts are around this. And so there are various areas that we think we're very much would like to have feedback on. Such things as what are the right number of sectors and how should those sectors be defined for the nominating committee? Are the skills and knowledge requirements for the board that we've outlined adequate? Do they make sense? Are we missing something? In this procedure, we've also have an attachment that talks about the formation of the initial board. The long-term thought is that the approval organization for new board members would be the board, but there is no board to start with. So who does approve the final selection of the nominating committee proposal? We have put forward that the formation committee might be an option for that. There certainly are other options that could be considered. We'd like to get some feedback on that. And then I mentioned earlier the concept of restricting the number of current governing body members that would be on the new board. We'd like some feedback on that as to whether that makes sense or not. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd open it up for any stakeholder comments or questions.
Thanks, Jim. Are there any other launch committee members that want to jump in here with additional input? I mean, Jim, your presentation was very thorough.
Might note that a lot of our discussions, we have a number of members on our committee who have participated in the nominating committee for the WEIM, for the RAP, the new board for the Northwest Power Pool, and some who've also participated in the ISO's nominating process. And so I think we've really been able to draw from a lot of direct experience in these processes and talk about how they can evolve and grow to meet the needs of this regional organization.
Tony, is your hand up or was that from the last time?
We're assuming from last time then.
Lower. I just found the lower hand button. Sorry.
That one's hidden. That one's hard. Joe, jump in.
Yeah, thanks. This is Joe Fina. I'm with the Snohomish County PUD up in Washington State. Jim, thanks for walking through that. I have a couple of questions about the joint meetings on slide 19.
Yep.
A couple of things. One, does a team foresee there being joint action being taken at those meetings by both boards? And two, is the idea that the joint meetings would occur only when there would be issues of joint authority, or could there be joint meetings on other issues? And I'll add a third one. If the idea is for both boards to maybe you have authority to do something, what kind of guardrails would there be around any actions coming out of those joint meetings?
So the concept here was for joint authority issues that we would have joint meetings. Now, having said that, once the two boards are in place, they have the right to have a joint meeting if they wish. I don't know that we can restrict that, but we're not trying to imply that there would be joint meetings routinely or on all issues, but only for those where they have authority over the same issue in the tariff. So for those things that are market design, it was not anticipated that there would be joint meetings, that there would be solely a meeting of the new RO board.
Sarah, will you stop sharing your screen and restart again? Because we got a weird black box.
Joe,
I
did that
think
help?
Sarah might be frozen.
Oh, yeah. I wonder. Let me see if I can. I'm happy to share my screen, but you guys will see how many millions of tabs I have open. And of course, I'm not sure that's different from any of the rest of you, but
It could crash your computer.
things could explode.
It could go badly, you know.
VJ?
Thank you. This may be a little dumb question, but
I do have a follow-up if I just could be.
I'm sorry,
if I could
Joe.
just,
I'm sorry,
no,
Joe.
That's all right. I was kind of waiting. Yeah, I was waiting
Go
for
ahead, Joe.
the black box issue to get resolved.
We might be here a while.
Just a quick follow-up. So the joint meetings would be informal
No, but
meetings.
my anticipation is those would be formal board meetings jointly held.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep. VJ.
Thank you. I think Joe hit the nail on where I was going with this, but I think I am trying to think on the left side of my brain. There is a legislation that is going to go to California and Sacramento to do XYZ that, blesses the independence and allow for whatever the policy end state is out of that legislation, which I still don't know. But can we and will we leverage the existing improvements and the changes that have been made to the EIM governing body and the equal status that it's going to get into this new structure? So in a way, I'm borrowing from Joe's question in that what would be the criteria for predicating joint meetings, but where will this RO board have its own independence in terms of its own decision-making and authority, if I'm making any sense?
Well, clearly that's what the whole basis of what we're trying to do here is to give the RO board an independent method for holding its own meeting, making its own decisions. That'll be in the bylaws that are developed for that. It'll be in the filing for the incorporation. So yeah, it's not intended that they're somehow under the ISO board. This is just looking at where there are actions that could affect both entities where there is joint authority, that it would make sense to have a joint meeting.
Thank you. And my last question, since I'm on the RIF, I am biasedly, this question is a leading question.
I love leading questions.
Exactly. So this is a legal group, so might as well create a leading question. Since yesterday's call demonstrated the benefits of the RIF and how its autonomy has been leveraged very effectively, if we were to envision a 3-stakeholder approach of proposals to be brought for implementation once an RO is working, a staff-led, stakeholder-led, stakeholder-staff joint, just a hypothetical vision, is there any thinking now or could be in the future for the RIF to be elevated to be reporting to the board directly. Right now, we report to the board, but we don't report like report. Having an independent and a group, all sector-based representation that formally reviews and responds to the board is something have you thought about? And I'm not speaking for the RIF members or RIF, I'm speaking just from my public interest representation of the RIF. Thank you.
Thanks for the leading question, and I'm going to defer that to our co-chairs for the stakeholder process as to where they think that might lead.
Vijay, I think I'm a little confused by your question because my understanding now is that the Regional Issues Forum is a group that is incorporated under the Western EIM governing body or the Western Market governing body, and that as that body evolves, I think the location of some type of members committee in the regional organization would have to also simultaneously involve. And so I maybe you could provide a little more clarity on where you see the point of intersection is.
I will work on my question and email it later more. I have it in my brain how that status quo could be enhanced, but I think it's going a bit out of the focus of this call. So my bad. I will come back and definitely follow up with you, Pam.
We will always be happy to accept your questions and any stakeholder questions at our Pathways inbox.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vijay. And Sarah's having some technical difficulties, so I'm unsharing because there's just too many things going on my own screens. But if I need to pull up a specific slide again, I'm happy to do that. Any other questions, concerns, support on what Jim walked through? I'm thinking particularly the process, the board selection process. Haven't gotten any questions or comment on that, and I know this is an area where we've had some discussion about who's what sectors are on the nominating committee, how many people are sitting on the nominating committee. We're discussing a transition here from the governing body to this new RO board. So there would be, thinking about some overlap and things like that. So feels like that inspired a couple of hands. Bonnie, go ahead.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I work with the Six Cities group, which is a group of LSCs within the CAISO BAA. So I wasn't sure whether this was the time because Jim didn't really get into describing the sectors, but when I looked at the materials beforehand, and I'd like to hear thoughts on where entities within the CAISO BAA or how entities within the CAISO BAA find or where they would have a voice as a BAA that would be comparable to the voice that EIM entities or EDAM entities would have as BAAs. Is the question clear?
So Bonnie, are you talking more generally or specifically about the nominating committee?
Well, I think the nominating committee, yeah, I mean, the nominating committee is an example, but also a little more generally, I sort of want to throw out just a concern that, so the effort here is to have a regional organization that's not tied to any particular market participant or geographical group. And the expectation is that if the CAISO continues to be the market operator on a contract basis, that it will operate the markets without favoritism toward any particular geographical area, and that's all great. But the CAISO also will continue to wear a hat as a balancing authority, and other types of participants in the market, EDAM entities, EIM entities, will have a voice as balancing authorities. And how does the CAISO balancing authority have a voice as a balancing authority when the CAISO as market operator is pledged to be independent?
Bonnie, I think this is a question that we have taken up primarily in our CAISO issues working group, where we're really thinking about kind of the separation of functions around the CAISO as the market operator as a balancing authority, and then the various stakeholders who are part of that. I think there are a number of different opportunities to balance that. And I know CAISO itself has done some thinking about whether it would need to potentially have staff that would represent the organization in a stakeholder process. But again, I think we are very preliminary in raising that question and not answering that question. So I think your perspectives and comments on that issue, especially as we get into the CAISO issues process. And Kathleen, I don't remember when we're having that workshop.
August 5th.
August 5th.
It'll be a marathon. It's like 6 hours or something.
It's a purple wave on my calendar. I've labeled them all in purple, but
it'll be fun.
Don't remember which.
Bring a brown bag.
But I think, Bonnie, you do bring up a question that we've been wrestling with and would appreciate as we work through that to get your comments and thinking as how to best address that.
Okay, thank you. I will, we'll participate. I will, or Meg McNall, who works with the same group, will participate in the August 5th workshop. But I do think it also has a place in the governance structure concerns and issues. In other words, when you think about sectors, when you think about ways of providing input for the nominating committee, I just encourage you to kind of think about that tension between the CAISO as market operator being independent, but then entities within the CAISO BAA having interests that need to be considered also, and there has to be a vehicle for doing that.
Bonnie, valid input. And as I mentioned earlier, I know we will be evolving the governance documents as the other work groups finalize their role. One thing I would note, if you look at the selection procedure under the current list of sectors, it does list a PTO rep. So we are trying to address some of that. May not have hit all of your issue with that, but at least try to address some of that.
Okay, appreciate it. Thanks very much.
And I mean, I think Bonnie also highlights a general point here that we've tried to batch a lot of these issues in order to come together and work through them and to try to make those delineations reasonable. But there is a lot of interrelationship between all of our working groups, which is something where we're trying to get input on these core questions. And then as we deliberate and come to conclusions, those conclusions and recommendations will have to be repercolated throughout the each different working group so that we end up in a consistent place, but that it's we're wrestling with very big questions, and with big questions, we have to sometimes break them up into smaller pieces to really get at the core of those issues.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. One more question. Where is the lower hand?
Your hand is lowered. You're good.
Yeah,
Okay. All right. Thanks very much.
we were kind of hoping for a permanent raise, but that's okay. Leah.
Yes, thank you all. Hi, Leah Rubin Shen with Advanced Energy United. And really appreciate the discussion this morning. Just wanted to put in another sort of comment on the nominating committee sectors. You know, one of the things that in full disclosure, my colleague Brian Turner sits on the launch committee representing technology providers. And I think we've been really happy to sort of see the diversity of perspectives on the launch committee, and would love to continue to sort of see that reflected here in the nominating committee sectors. So this is a plug for perhaps a technology provider sector as part of the nominating committee. I mean, I think, you know, we heard a lot yesterday on the stakeholder workshop about, you know, the challenge sometimes when a sector is trying to capture too many types of voices, and then there's, you know, there's conflict within the sector, and maybe certain parties within that sector don't feel represented. The suppliers and marketers of generation energy service providers feels probably pretty big. And so maybe that's one where it could actually be two different, that could be split into two different sectors, have sort of two different perspectives. So that's my comment, but thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the feedback. Nora?
Oh, thank you. I just want to say how much I appreciate, as a large commercial and industrial consumer advocate, appreciated the proposal to not only break out consumer advocates from public interest and have them be in their different sectors, but then also break out the small residential consumer advocates from the large CNI consumer advocates, and just wanted to say how much I appreciated that thoughtfulness in the proposal. And we'll be putting in, Clico will be putting in comments on this. Thank you.
VJ.
I just had a quick, I wasn't sure where the direction of today's content was going, but I will take Pam's advice and I'll work with our consultant Elaine to send some comments in. But I did want to put a plug here, as you're creating something new in the West, to have tribal engagement from the get-go to be included or factored in, because currently the tribals communities and the tribal authorities are connected through the utilities that they are contracting with, unless they produce their own power, and therefore decision-making and voices are not easily heard. I've received mixed bag comments around the WAPA process. So big request here to, at the risk of being too democratic initially, but the RO sectors initially should have tribal representation, even if it's just one seat, and they can work within themselves to organize. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Jim, if I might jump in on that too.
Yes.
I think a couple of thoughts on that. I think, you know, we have in the launch committee from the get-go had quite a few conversations about how to do better outreach and engagement with tribes. And I think this has been a tricky thing. So we would love ideas and continued guidance on how we can better engage with tribes and get their input into this process, and then think about what that longer term engagement looks like. The other thing that I'll mention too is that, you know, within the context of this conversation and the RO governance piece, and we're looking at sector representation for the nominating committee at this point. That's really the sort of the confines of this discussion right now. And I think that the idea is that we want to make sure that we have broad representation within that group, but also a manageable group for that particular piece, because it is a very narrow sort of task in front of that particular entity. We are having a conversation at our next stakeholder process workshop, which will be next week, about the role of sectors and voting in the stakeholder process. And I think there's an open question still as to whether or not we should even have designated sectors. But I will say, as we have had some of these conversations, one of the things that we want to make sure that we are doing across these different discussions is that as we're talking about sectors, that we have consistent definitions of what those sectors are. So I'm just sort of planting that right now. I think your point about tribal engagement is a really important one, and we all need to figure out how to do that better. And we need to find a way to provide not just access, but an easier way to take advantage of that access, regardless of what structure and sectors we end up having, and for what in the future process. So I'll just sort of flag that piece for ongoing discussion.
I don't see any other raised hands or chat comments. Would like to remind the stakeholders that part of the materials that have been sent out does include the very preliminary draft RO board selection procedure. And there's a lot in there. Like I said, we made a first cut at sectors. We made some recommendations on how to select the first initial board. It's not a long read. I would appreciate any comments or feedback from the stakeholders on that selection process as we evolve that. So that would be very much appreciated. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Kathleen.
Excellent. And I'm going to share my screen again so we can talk through some of our next steps. As Jim mentioned, and Lisa mentioned this before, we really do want your feedback and your comments. We're going to have a 2-week comment period, really specific to the topics that we discussed today. So focusing on RO formation and RO governance, opening today and running for the next 2 weeks. Comments will be due on August 8th. You can submit them to the comments at westwidepathwaysinitiative.org email address. And then we have a stakeholder comment template for this workshop with some specific questions that we'd love your input on, available on the WEEB Pathways Initiative landing page. I will say we've got this 2-week window. It's specific to this workshop. Again, please, if you have other questions or comments that are, broader, or connected to, how are things interacting, or whatever your comment or question is, please do submit those. We'll be taking these on a rolling basis, as we are continuing to have meetings of these work groups to be able to incorporate this feedback that we, some of the questions and thoughts that we got today, as well as questions and feedback that we will be, receiving on an ongoing basis. So please do submit your thoughts, reach out. We want to hear from you. At this point, if we don't hear from you, we're going to assume that what we're proposing is that we're on the right track. So if you have feelings otherwise or other suggestions, we want to hear those as we go. With that, we have more workshops. Right now we have a public interest workshop scheduled for next week, although that may actually change. Surprise to the rest of my work group here, but we're revisiting that one. But we have as I mentioned, our 3rd stakeholder process workshop scheduled for next Friday. Again, that'll be really focusing on sort of the conversation around sectors and voting, and what role either or both of those may play in a stakeholder process. We have our tariff analysis and CAISO issues workshop, which is again the doozy of purple block on Pam's calendar. This is a big one. It's a 6-hour meeting. We're going to cover a lot of ground, and it's going to be a technical conversation, but I think is one that is really important to how this new regional organization is going to work and how it's going to work with the CAISO, and some of the real sort of sticky questions that we've gotten about how these two entities are going to operate together. We'll be sort of talking through some of the ideas and research and evaluation that we've been doing during that. And then we'll have our sort of last stakeholder process workshop on August 28th, and are hoping to have a bit of a straw proposal at that point for people to provide feedback and input into that will build on all of the feedback and input that we've gotten to this point. Just another reminder too of our overarching time frame. We have, again, workshops going over the course of July and August. When we receive comments and all the public comments and feedback, we are going to be incorporating that and putting together a comprehensive proposal for what this regional organization could look like and the various processes associated with it. And our goal is to have that out to the public by the end of September, where we will open up a public comment period for 4 weeks, taking us to close to the end of October. We will have another big stakeholder meeting where we'll walk through that proposal and sort of, be able to answer questions and hear comments at that stage. But once comments are due on October 25th, we will then take some time to incorporate that feedback and make final revisions with the goal of having a final proposal ready for the launch committee to take a public vote on by the 3rd week of November. So it is a quick timeline, and this is a lot of information, and we're moving very quickly, and we recognize that. And so we are hoping that the rest of you all will do the same, take some time, provide some thoughtful feedback as we move along, because it really is important to the work that we're doing. With that, any other closing remarks, Pam, or any other launch committee members?
I appreciate your continued engagement in these complex issues. I think that has been a key theme that we've heard today, is just the interrelationship and complexity of some of the pieces of governance that we're working on. And so as we work through all of these different workshops, really appreciate that sustained engagement and all of the time that you are all taking to actively participate, share your thoughts and feedback, and hopefully provide us with written comments so that we can really look for those consensus positions as we move this forward.
Any other final questions from the public? All right, fantastic. Thank you all. Thanks for coming. Thanks for your echoing all of Pam's thanks. And I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. Thanks, everyone.